The wind was screaming through the frozen December night, the kind of cold that made even the city lights shiver. Snow swirled violently across the empty streets as midnight crept in like a quiet thief. Billionaire Adrian Halle sat in the back of his luxury car, lost in numbers, power, and the world he had built from steel and ambition. A world where emotions no longer had a place. His life was predictable now: meetings, deals, money, everything controlled down to the second. Nothing surprised him anymore. Until the car slowed at a lonely bus stop. There, barely visible under the flickering street lamp, was a woman curled against the freezing wind. Her thin diner uniform clung to her trembling body, her blonde hair coated with snow, her arms wrapped tightly around herself in a desperate attempt to stay warm. She looked like a fading ghost of someone life had forgotten. But when the headlights washed over her face, Adrian's heart stopped. His breath locked. Because the woman freezing at the abandoned bus stop.
The night was colder than anything December had offered in years, the kind of cold that didn't just cling to the skin, but pushed into the bones like invisible shards of ice. Snow drifted across the empty streets as the city's lights flickered against the storm. Adrian Hale, the billionaire CEO known for his ruthless precision and immaculate composure, sat in the back of his chauffeured car reviewing documents that had consumed his life for far too long. He barely looked up anymore, barely noticed the world outside the tinted windows. But then the car slowed, and instinct tugged at him, forcing his eyes toward the bus stop on the corner, toward a figure curled against the frozen wind. A woman, shaking violently, wrapped in a thin, worn-out uniform that a diner waitress would wear. Her blonde hair, once so full and bright, hung limp with snow and exhaustion. And as the car's headlights illuminated her face, Adrian felt his breath lock inside his chest, because the woman at the bus stop was his ex-wife, Evelyn. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the beauty of humanity, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us continue creating stories that touch the heart. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze along with her. The storm, the traffic, the flickering lights, everything blurred into insignificance as old memories rushed into him like a tidal wave. Adrian had spent 7 years trying to outrun the past, burying himself in mergers, negotiations, and the suffocating lifestyle of a man whose success came at the cost of everything softer in his soul. Evelyn had been the last warm thing in his world, the only person who ever dared to challenge him, love him, and leave him. Their divorce, cold and bitter, had been a wound he carried quietly but deeply. But nothing prepared him for the sight of her reduced to such fragile vulnerability under a bus stop shelter that barely held against the night. He ordered the driver to stop, but he could barely hear his own voice over the pounding in his chest. Before the car had even fully halted, Adrian pushed the door open and stepped into the storm. The wind slapped him in the face, but he didn't care. His expensive coat whipped behind him as he approached her slowly, each step shaking him more than the frozen pavement. He never expected to see Evelyn again, let alone like this, shivering, pale, clutching a small paper bag as if it were the last piece of dignity she had left. She didn't notice him at first. Her head was bowed, her breath fogging weakly in the air, her fingers stiff and red from the cold. And when she finally looked up, her eyes widened not with recognition, but with the stunned disbelief of someone who no longer expected miracles. There was exhaustion in her gaze, a quiet surrender that frightened him more than the storm around them. Adrian realized in that moment that whatever had happened to her had not happened quickly. This was the kind of weariness that built slowly, painfully, through days and nights of struggling alone. Something inside him cracked. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But the silence between them felt louder than any words. Adrian guided her into the car, shielding her from the wind with his coat, even as she weakly protested. She was lighter than he remembered. Too light. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she sat down, and he felt something sharp twist inside him. He had once promised to protect her. He had once been her home. And now she was a stranger collapsing into the warm air of a chauffeured car that no longer belonged to her world. As the car pulled away from the bus stop, the city passing by in streaks of gray and white, Evelyn sat very still, staring at her hands. The dim interior lights highlighted the dark circles beneath her eyes, the subtle signs of hunger and exhaustion that no one living comfortably would ever notice. Adrian wanted to speak, to ask what happened, to demand answers from the universe or from himself, but something held him back. Maybe shame. Maybe fear. Maybe the sudden realization that despite the years, despite the distance, he still cared. The drive was long and quiet. Evelyn didn't ask where they were going. Adrian didn't tell her. He simply brought her to his penthouse, the one place he had always kept untouched by the world's noise. When they stepped inside, the warmth hit her like sunlight after winter. She swayed a little, and he instinctively reached out, steadying her. For a moment, her cheek brushed his hand, and it felt like a memory, searching for a place to live again. She sat on the couch near the fireplace as he made her tea, the steam curling into the air like fragile hope. He kept glancing at her, absorbing every detail he had forgotten or forced himself to forget. The shape of her face, the soft way she breathed, the quiet strength that still clung to her even in her weakest moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and rough, as though it had been kept silent for too long. She told him her life had slowly unraveled after the divorce. She had left the city to escape the shadows of their past, but tragedy had a cruel way of following those already wounded. Her mother fell ill, the medical bills swallowed her savings, and she worked long shifts at a roadside diner to stay afloat. When her mother passed, Evelyn had been left with nothing but debt and grief. She moved back to the city trying to find stability, but the cost of living suffocated any hope she had. She had been living in a small shared room, barely affording rent, taking double shifts wherever she could. Tonight, the buses were delayed due to the storm, and she had been waiting for hours in the freezing cold. As she spoke, Adrian felt his chest tighten with guilt. Not because he caused her hardships, but because he had once promised to shield her from the world, yet she faced its worst storms alone. Their marriage had ended because of his coldness, his obsession with work, his inability to give her the love she needed. Now he saw clearly, his success meant nothing if the one person who once made him feel human was suffering in silence. He offered her a guest room, warm clothes, a hot meal. She tried to refuse at first, insisting she didn't want charity, but her body was too weak, her spirit too tired to fight. Watching her try to maintain dignity even in her brokenness broke something inside him. He realized that Evelyn had never been after his money or status. She had only ever wanted the man behind it, the man he had buried under years of ambition. For the next few days, Evelyn stayed in the penthouse to recover. She slept for long hours, ate quietly, walked slowly. Adrian watched her from a distance, respecting her space, but unable to hide the hope blooming inside him. He had spent years surrounded by luxury, yet none of it filled the cold spaces inside him until she walked back into his life, even if by accident. One morning, he found her standing by the window overlooking the snowy skyline. She looked stronger, though still fragile, like a flower finding sunlight after too much winter. She thanked him for everything with a soft sincerity that made his throat tighten. But he sensed something else in her, a quiet fear. She didn't want to depend on him. She didn't want to stay where she didn't belong. And she didn't want to reopen old wounds. But Adrian wasn't the man he used to be. The storm that night didn't just bring her back into his life. It broke open the walls he had built around his heart. He realized what mattered, who mattered. He gently told her that she didn't owe him anything. She didn't owe the world anything, But she deserved safety. She deserved comfort. She deserved kindness. And whether or not she chose to stay in his life, he would do everything he could to help her rebuild hers. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back, staring at the city as if searching for a reason to trust again. She whispered that she didn't know how to start over. She had lost too much: her mother, her savings, her confidence, her sense of belonging. She didn't think she had the strength. But Adrian did, and he offered it to her, not through grand romantic gestures, but through something deeper, through patience, through steady presence, through simply being there in a world where she had been alone for too long. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Evelyn found a new job, not as a waitress, but in a small art studio where she could use the talents she once buried under responsibility. Adrian didn't interfere, didn't try to control, didn't pressure her. He simply supported her quietly, offering encouragement and space in equal measure. For the first time in years, they existed not as lovers or ex-spouses, but as two people healing beside each other. But healing has a way of opening doors to old emotions. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the windows, Evelyn sat beside the fireplace, sketching something with gentle strokes. Adrian stood nearby, watching her with a tenderness he no longer tried to hide. When she finally showed him the drawing, it took his breath away. It was the scene of the bus stop that night. The storm, the icy air, the faint glow of headlights, and her small, fragile shape curled against the cold. But in the corner of the sketch, barely visible, she had drawn a figure stepping toward her. Not a billionaire, not a CEO, not a man of power, just a man who cared. The meaning was clear. The moment had changed both of them. Who they were, who they could become. If this story touched your heart in any way, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more stories like this reach people who need them. And before you go, comment below. Do you believe people deserve a second chance at love and life? Story complete.